This is the Let's Go Win podcast with your host, J.M. Ryerson.
What's happening, you guys? Welcome back to the Let's Go Win podcast, where we are here to help you be happy, healthy, wealthy, not necessarily in that order, but it's certainly the goal and intent of the show, and to get better every day. And the guest we have today is going to help us with that. He has done some amazing stuff. He's a funny guy and he likes to laugh, which I'm a big fan of. A highly sought after speaker, trainer, and coach known as Jim Carrey with a PhD. Dr. Danny Brassell has spoken to over 3,500 audiences worldwide and authored 16 books, including his latest, Leadership Begins with Motivation. He helps entrepreneurs, executives, and small business owners boost their business and impact by improving their communication skills. Danny, what's happening, brother? How are you?
Not much. Thank you so much for having me, JM. More importantly, thanks for spreading some joy around the world. We need a lot more of you.
Well, thank you. And clearly you like to spread joy, because off air we were briefly chatting, and you laughter is clearly a huge part of your life. And even in the intro, Jim Carrey with a PhD, not a bad little coin term, nickname for you, brother. So I'm just going to start there. We're not going to go into all the cool stuff you've done, but why is humor so important to you? Why is it clearly a part of your DNA?
Well, I mean, we just went through a pandemic. It's actually one of the things I've been kind of really relating to a lot of the business people I work with when they're creating their presentations. I know sad stories work. There's plenty of research that shows that, but there's three reasons why I train people not to do that. First of all, the world just survived a pandemic. Everybody's had some bad stuff happen to them. And I think we need a lot more hope in the world right now. Secondly, I always remind people, well, do you really want to tell this sad story 1,000 times? I mean, I have a friend and his daughter was murdered in a school shooting, and he tells that story to audiences all the time. You have to be stronger than me, JM, to talk about the worst day of your life repeatedly. And then third, and this is where people get angry with me, I have one goal for my audiences. I want people laughing and feeling better than when they came in. There's something admirable about that. I can tell the same joke again and again, and I'm just trying to get a smile on your face. I believe the people that try to manipulate their audience with their sad stories, after the 20th time they've told it, I think those are crocodile tears. I think it's very inauthentic. I don't even buy that they're sad anymore. And that's where people get angry with me. But I mean, just look at it. There was actually an episode of Cheers long ago, I remember, where Norm was in charge of firing people, and he would always take the people to Cheers and buy them a beer, and he'd cry and they'd feel bad, and they're like, okay, I'm fired, that's fine. And after about the 20th person, the guy Norm couldn't cry, and he's like, hey, this is a jip, I thought you were supposed to cry. And he tries to cry, and I'm like, yeah, that's exactly, he's become desensitized to it. And I really think that's what happens when you're crying all the time. Plus, life's too short. Talking to you, you're like, I live in Boca and I love it. I'm like, good for you, man. Most people are miserable. I can't stand being around people who are miserable. Like, figure out where you are, and if you don't like it, one of my mentors, Jim Rohn, he used to say, if you want to change. You're not a tree.
Well, it's a hell of a mentor to have, man. He has clearly changed a lot of lives, and you're doing that as well, which is amazing. It is fascinating, brother, because the idea, and this does happen often. I'll be outside. How's the weather? I'm like, if I start talking about the weather, I have officially lost my mind. Like, I can't control the weather, so why am I going to bitch about it? I don't understand it. So I love that leadership is a huge part of what you do. Obviously, it's really what you have built. But tell me your story, man. Why is leadership so important? How did you get into this world and have such an amazing mentor like Jim?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jam. I've actually been blessed with lots of wonderful mentors, from Jim to Zig Ziglar to Steve and Rob Schallenberger, just wonderful people that are constantly emphasizing that no matter what you do in life, you're always a leader, even if it's just of yourself. You have to lead yourself, and I completely agree with that. And my background as an inner city teacher, I find with students, I'm like, there are plenty of successful readers that don't necessarily become successful leaders, but I have never read about somebody that's successful as a leader who isn't more affected by being an avid reader. And so the book that I'm going to give everybody in your audience was inspired. I wanted to research, what are people reading and things like that. And it doesn't matter what industry, so you look at the military, generals like General Schwarzkopf can read in 4 languages and quote Shakespeare voraciously. Patton was the same way. If you look in business, wealthiest people in the world, people like Elon Musk, who's running $4 billion company, still reads at least 1 book a day. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest people on the planet, he spends all of his time reading at the office every single day. You look in athletics, I could have kissed LeBron James. They showed him in the locker room before his first NBA Finals for the Miami Heat, and he was reading The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I'm like, oh man, you just did more to get kids excited about reading than I'll ever do in my entire lifetime. Political leaders. So a lot of people forget that when Kennedy was president, a journalist asked him what he was reading, and he said, "Oh, I'm reading this really cool spy novel about this guy named James Bond. It's written by this guy Ian Fleming." Well, based on that press conference, MGM bought the rights to James Bond, and that's why we got the James Bond movies, was because of that. And so it really doesn't matter what you're doing. Everybody that wants to be more effective is going to be an avid reader.
So I didn't know that about Elon. That's remarkable. A book
yeah.
a day. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. Clearly, he's got speed reading down, or he's certainly a faster reader than I. What does it look like your daily reading habit? Because I have my own, and my audience has heard me talk about, I'm passionate about books. I'm passionate about reading them. I'm passionate about talking about them. But it seems like it's become this dying thing, and I don't like that, right? I want people to continue because I think it changes our perspective. What do you do for your specific reading routine? Is it a book a day like Elon? I mean, that's crazy, by the way. That's a wild stat.
Well, I had read one of my favorite books was The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. It's part of a trilogy about Teddy Roosevelt. It takes you to the moment he becomes president. The second book is called Theodore Rex, which takes you through his presidency. And then the final book is called Colonel Roosevelt, which takes you after his presidency. And after I read the first book, I didn't know, by the time he was 30 years old, Teddy Roosevelt had read over 20,000 books. And even when he was president of the United States, they say he averaged between 1 and 3 books read per day. And when I tell that to kindergartners, they're like, wow. And I'm like, so kids, we're going to start reading 10 books a day, which I still do read 10 books a day. Many of them are scratch and sniff and pop up, but I do read 10 books a day. Everybody's busy out there. And one of the strategies I always share with people is, if you want to be a little bit more interesting and sound a little bit sharper, before you go to a cocktail party, stop by Barnes and Noble or the public library, go to the children's section. I read children's picture biographies of famous people all the time. So I'll get to know some interesting things. I can read those really quickly. I mean, obviously, I still read lots of heavier books, but the book on Elon Musk, his biography by Ashley Vance, was fascinating. I didn't realize he was bullied all the time as a kid in South Africa. And so to escape the bullies, he spent all his time in the public library until he read every single book in the public library. So then he went to the bookstore and he read all the books in the bookstore. And even today, that's what he's doing. He's reading a book a day. That book was fascinating for 2 reasons. I loved it. There was 2 stories in that book that I thought were fascinating. Was he's having Mexican food with his biographer, and he looks at him and he says, I'm considering allocating 8.25 hours per week to my new girlfriend. Is that sufficient? I mean, Who talks like it was like Spock. I was fascinated. And then the other story I liked was some of his engineers were getting annoyed at SpaceX because he'd go around the floor asking them questions all the time. And they're like, man, I already got this job. I know what I'm doing. And then they started talking to one another and they realized, wait a second, he's listening to our answers. He's forming better questions. And we think he's actually learned it better than we understand it now. And I'm like, wow, that's a person, he's a photographic memory, amazing person like that. I mean, I don't have that. For the people out there that are struggling, I try to start and end the day with reading something positive. So get away from social media. That's always going to be negative. I'll read the Bible, or I'll read like a joke book or something like that. And again, that's the other thing I want people to understand. Reading doesn't just have to be books. I mean, so many people think that reading is Dostoevsky, War and Peace. I mean, reading is reading a good article in Sports Illustrated. Reading can be, we're talking to a lot of entrepreneurs and people that are interested in personal development. Just read positive articles like that. It's one of the things I point out to people when I'm working with them on their speeches is I try to have them share examples from their own lives, but some people just are cranky and say, oh, nothing interesting has ever happened to me. I'm like, well, first of all, that's a lie. But second of all, okay, well, let's look at one of the most successful self-help books of all time. It's called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, in which he shares no personal stories in that book. All of his stories are about successful people he interviewed. I mean, it's kind of like if somebody was just to listen to your podcast all the time, well, that's educating them. These are the people I want to be around. I can't stand people that are watching the news all the time. That's the worst show on TV. It's depressing. Nothing positive. President Ford, when he was president, he had a great line because when he was president, he always read the sports section first. And the journalists were freaking out. They're like, you're the leader of the free world. Why do you read the sports section first? And he said, well, the sports section hails man's accomplishments. The front page only shows his failures. And I'm like, a lot of wisdom there. So, you can end your day reading the comics. I'll read comics all the time. Something that makes you happy, though. Something that, the leadership book, the last one I wrote, The Leadership Begins with Motivation, that was inspired when I was a middle school teacher. I was the only teacher in the school who had no tardy students, because I always started class by reading a Paul Harvey story. I don't know if you remember Paul Harvey, JM. I mean,
grew up with it, brother. Love it. Yeah.
Yeah. He passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 325 years old. I mean, he used to come on the radio every day at 12:15. He'd be like, I'm Paul Harvey, with the rest of the story. And for 5 minutes, you're trying to figure out who's he talking about or what's the company or whatever. And I love those stories. And my students love those stories. But JM, some of those stories are about like Sears Roebuck. Well, kids today, they don't know what Sears Roebuck is. And so the book I wrote was more of an updated version with people like Michael Jordan and Jeff Bezos, things like that. And it was interesting. After I wrote that book, I read it, and completely unintentionally, I realized a lot of my stories are about white male Americans. And so the book I'm writing right now is predominantly female, minorities, and international examples. And I'm having a ton of fun writing this book because I've been learning so much about things that, it's kind of like you and I being products of the American school system. We're kind of just shown the important American examples, but we forget there's some pretty significant examples of, like, I'll give you a cool story I just wrote about. Do you know who Cliff Young is?
No.
You'll love this story. So Cliff Young in the early 1980s was a sheep farmer. He was 60 years old. He'd been running after sheep for a couple of days, and he decided to run in this ultra marathon with like 30-year-olds. The ultra marathon went from Sydney to Melbourne, 535 miles. It lasts 10 days. And all of these ultra marathoners show up. And then 60-year-old sheep farmer Cliff Young shows up in his overalls and his galoshes. And they're looking at him like, are you serious? And they start to run. And of course, he's in last place. And then that night, everybody falls asleep on the side of the road so they can continue the next day. Well, nobody told Cliff that you were supposed to sleep. And so he ran through the night, and he ran through the night the next night and the next night. And not only did 60-year-old sheep farmer Cliff Young win the ultramarathon, second place was 10 hours behind him. And then the best part of the story was when they gave him the prize money, he didn't know that there was prize money, and he felt bad. And so he distributed it among all the other competitors. And now the race is named after him. He's been hugely honored. He passed away. But I'm like, I've never even heard of this guy. This is the greatest story I've ever heard.
There's so many great things from that story because he didn't put any restrictions on himself. He didn't know any different. So he just keeps going. I can only imagine the sheep farmer showing up and the look of all these really fit athletes with all their gear, and they probably have the whole group of people that caravanning with them. And this dude, hard as nails, probably because he's been out with sheep. That's remarkable. You did something there that I want people to understand. When you talked about Paul Harvey, you immediately transported me into the truck with my dad.
Ugh.
And you brought back some of the most fond memories, even though at the time as a kid, I was like, God, can we listen to, something else, Dad? And I like rap and hip hop, and my dad wouldn't listen to that, as he called it, crap. But you absolutely transported me to a time that I could relate to. And this is something that amazing storytellers do. And I want you to just talk about this because I think this is how you relate to people. I love that you said the next book you're writing is on other, ethnicities and minorities and things so other people can relate to it, because that's what you did for me talking about Paul Harvey. Can you talk about the effectiveness of being a storyteller and being a leader and why that's so important? Because you just did it for me. And I have all these warm memories about my dad. I lost him last year, not to go into my story, but you brought me back to a very happy place. And I think that's what amazing storytellers do.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sorry about your father. I lost my father several years ago, and it's, but you're your father. Just remember that you're his legacy all the time. And, being a Christian, I realized that a lot of people, they wonder if their parents are proud of them. And I know for a fact, all of our parents are proud of us, because I know God's proud of me, and I look at my kids and they could do no wrong. I mean, I'm always going to be proud of them. So I'll work with, I still do it occasionally, but I would fly out to a company for 2 days and work with a team of their executives, creating what I call a stump speech. You'll hear some people call it a signature talk. I call it a stump speech because before I was a teacher, I was a journalist, and I covered President Bush Sr. in the '92 election, and he'd give the same speech like 20 times a day. I could give his speech better than he could after a while. And so I call it a stump speech. Basically, the purpose is, how do you get people who don't know who you are to want to do, well, what I call it, want to take the next step with you, whether that's to purchase your product or to donate to your cause, or really even just to accept your ideas. And one of the things I share with now, what I'll do instead of flying out for 2 days with a company, now I do a lot of these Zooms where I'll get, I like to limit it to no more than 10 people. So 8 to 10 people. I like to have 8 to 10 people because they still get the personalized attention from me, but they also get to hear other people and tweak their own presentations based on that. And one of the first things I'll share with them, I say, okay, I'm going to give you a lot of information. I know you're going to be freaked out. I don't want you to freak out. Later on, I want you to get a libation of your choice. I want you to get out pen and paper, and I want you to start writing down every story that's ever happened to you in your life. And I don't mean the whole story. I just mean triggers, like, the time I locked myself out of the car out in front of Costco, the time Dad spilt mustard on his tie in that fancy restaurant. And you'll find that in just an hour, you'll come up with 400 to 500 stories, little triggers. So that's the first part of the exercise. And then the second part of the exercise then is to figure out, well, what's that really a story about? Oh, well, this is really a story about responsibility. Oh, this is a story about accountability. And this is how you form a good stump speech. The formula works for any type of speech, because I have about 50 different types of speeches I do. And so I was speaking to a company a couple of weeks ago, and I had a new speech. And so the way I start, I like your childhood stories to me are always the best ones, because everybody was a kid. You transport people, like you were just talking about. And so the story I started off with, I said, when I was teaching elementary school, every other teacher at my school went through hundreds, if not thousands, of Band-Aids every single school year. I mean, kids love Band-Aids. They work better than smokes on the prison yard. Well, every single year, I only went through one Band-Aid. And my colleagues could never believe it. They're like, how do you do that? I say, well, on the first day of school, I always have a chubby kid in class. We'll call him Paco. He's picking at his scab all morning, finally has success after lunch recess. And the annoying little girl next to him raises her hand, rubs her nose, and says, Mr. Marcel, Paco's bleeding. And I make a big production. I say, oh my gosh, you know what you need, Paco? You need a Band-Aid. Now I have 33 little heads looking at me with smiles on their face. And I say, you know what? I've got a desk full of Band-Aids, and I don't have just ordinary Band-Aids. I have Mighty Morphin Power Ranger Band-Aids. And I'm going to give you the Green Ranger, Paco, because he's the coolest. Now all the kids are just smiling with joy. I take Paco to my desk and say, oh, before I put on the Band-Aid, we got to clean out the wound. So then I take out the rubbing alcohol, show that to the kids. I say, Paco, hold on to this, hold on to my hand. This might sting a little bit. He starts screaming bloody murders. I pour the rubbing alcohol on. I put on the Band-Aid, say, there's your Band-Aid. Hey, anybody else need a Band-Aid? My students can have a skull fracture, JM, and they will never, ever ask me for a Band-Aid. So, ladies and gentlemen, today, I'm not going to give you Band-Aids. I'm going to give you practical strategies that will help you grow your business, increase your impact, and most importantly, give you the freedom you've always desired. So that's how I start the presentation. It has nothing really to do with what I'm going to talk about, but what it's done is it's gotten people to giggle and smile. And you don't have to be, Jerry Seinfeld to be funny. You just need to get people in your audience to smile. I mean, I work with a lot of Indian engineers who are looking for ways to liven up their presentations. And so I had one gentleman, I'm not going to give you his real name, but he has a difficult name. He's like, Danny, I need to connect with my audience. And so his name, so now the way he starts his presentation, he's like, hello, my name is Maji Maharaji. Gee, I sure hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, it's not a huge hysterical line, but it's enough to get everybody to smile and say, oh, this guy doesn't take himself too seriously. That's the important thing more than anything. I mean, when a person takes themselves too seriously, I'm like, well, you just need to teach kindergarten for a week. When I was a kindergarten teacher, one of my little girls, LaShonda, raises her hand. I'm like, LaShonda, question. And she's like, Miss Brassell, when are you going to trim your nose hair? Like this afternoon. Thanks for bringing that to my attention, LaShonda. I ain't all that, and neither are you. Stop taking yourself so dang seriously. So it's a very long answer to, I give long answers to your short questions, but this is what effective leaders are doing. I mean, if you want to become better at speaking to having an impact, there's only two ways to do it. First of all, you got, Jim used to say, you can't pay other people to do your push-ups. You got to do the work. You got to get out there and speak. And so I tell people, go on podcasts, go to Rotary Club, Optimist Club, Kiwanis Club, Lions Club, go to schools, go to your synagogue, your church, your mosque, whatever, get out there and just do the work that way. And then you need to watch lots of speakers. So I watch speakers all the time. I'll watch politicians. I'll watch televangelists. I'll watch comedians. I watch them in front of big groups, in front of small groups, in front of international groups, in front of all women. Here's a strategy for everybody in your audience, JM, if they want to really become a lot better at this. I watch a lot of award shows because when the person wins the Academy Award, they only have 45 seconds to connect with that audience. And I'm always interested in, are they going to use those 45 seconds wisely? Now, most of them don't. Most of them are like, I want to thank God. I want to thank the Academy. It's just stupid. Nobody wants to hear the presentation. But every now and then you get a gem. So a couple of years ago, there was a British guy. He won the Academy Award for Best Editing. So this is Hollywood's elite, all these movie stars, they don't really care about the editor. Well, he gets up there and his name was Joe Walker. And he says, a lot of people don't know this, but when phrased properly, the term Academy Award nominee can be used as an insult. Well, now like the entire audience is paying attention to him. And he said, for example, yesterday I got in an argument with my 17-year-old daughter and she said, well, Academy Award nominee Joe Walker. And all of a sudden, everybody is laughing hysterically. And this guy, JM, who nobody was paying attention to, I'm watching him get off stage. Benedict Cumberbatch wants to meet him. Zendaya wants to meet him. And I'm like, wow, that's the power of a really good presentation. And when you see people, this isn't political, but President Reagan was one of my favorites because he had a way. Here's a guy that had a mansion. He was a former Hollywood movie star, had a mansion in Bel Air, but he was so personable. He was able to convince like an auto worker in Detroit, hey, that's a guy that could have a beer with me. I mean, that's powerful. That's a powerful connection point. And so that's what I'm always looking for is, well, what can you do to connect with your audience?
Well, and I think, again, some of the examples that you cited, it's just being authentic, truly being yourself. Because look, if you put on a facade, people are going to see through it. Maybe not the first time, but you're not going to really connect. That's what, again, use Reagan. I remember watching him and just being mystified by this gentleman because he seemed like that could be my grandfather, that could be my dad, that could be someone I want to hang out with. And he just had amazing ability. I want to ask about the book because leadership begins with motivation. Clearly, it's a very strategic title. I'm curious on that because motivation sometimes gets good press and sometimes it gets bad press. And it's become this polarizing thing, like motivation's crap or motivation is, you need it. And so I'm really curious how you came up with that title and why that is a true statement. How leadership begins with motivation.
Well, it's not as deep as you would think, JM. First of all, people have to chill out. Everybody loves to be polarized now. I mean, I'm like, folks, I've said some of the most inane things, and there's always three people that choose to be annoyed. And one of my mentors once said something great because, and this is something everybody has to take away, was I had given a speech, and let's say 499 people thought it was the greatest thing ever, but I got this one complaint. And rather than focus on the 499 that loved it, I focused on the one complaint. And this mentor of mine, Jim Trelease, he said something I'll never forget. He's like, Danny, what you're forgetting is 5% of your audience, they hate you. And they hated you before they ever met you. There are people that will find something wrong with anything. And it's exactly the truth. And I always have the same thing when a person insults me or say, oh, I just hated you. I'll say, well, thank you for that feedback. I'm sorry you chose to be offended. I always use the choice.
I love the word. I love it.
Yes. Everything is a choice. Now, leadership begins with motivation. I believe that leadership begins with you. You need to, everybody can say whatever they want. I mean, I love to make fun of my friends that talk about the law of attraction. I'm like, there's no such thing as a law of attraction. Gravity is a law. I mean, if I drop a pencil, it falls to the floor. That is a law. If there was a law of attraction, that would mean that Scarlett Johansson, all I had to do was think about her and Scarlett Johansson would be attracted to me. I'm like, I don't think so. It doesn't work that way. The way everything begins is getting up off of your hindsight and doing the work. So leadership begins with motivation. Motivation begins with you. Now, people can go crazy, but there's all kinds of inherent traits. I'm like, no, not really. I mean, I see a lot of people that aren't as talented as other people. They're not as educated as other people, but what they do really well is they do things. I mean, think of the critics of your podcast, Jim. I mean, there's something that you did that I guarantee you none of them ever did. They didn't create a podcast. And when I talk to people that are afraid of getting on stages, I'm like, you're doing something most of those people aren't doing. You're getting on a stage. You're putting yourself out there. Now people might not like the work. I get that. I flop all the time. But Teddy Roosevelt said the credit belongs to the person who's in the arena. And, it's like when I listen to people criticize President Biden or President Trump, I'm like, well, there's something that those two did that none of us did. They ran. I would never, I don't know about you, JM, but when I was a kid, I wanted to be president of the United States. Now that's probably right below being a janitor at a facility for toxic waste for me. There's no way. I want to be, what I want to be is the former president of the United States, because then I get like 20 million from my biography. I get to golf wherever I want. I get to be a statesperson, and people ask my opinion and they have to. I don't want to. Who wants that job? It's nothing but negative energy. I want to be, I like being around people that laugh all that. That's why I love kindergartners. Kindergartners laugh at anything. They just they're smiling and they're happy. That's why I love volunteering with the Special Olympics. You see people, they're the happiest people on earth. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe they know something the rest of us don't know. So leadership begins with motivation. If people believe it begins with something else, here's my invitation: write a book.
Yeah, one of the things, so getting back to the law of attraction for a moment, I agree with you. It's not a law. However, what you really said there, and this is why being the president sounds awful, because all it is negative. And they've shown how much people age in those 4 years, or God forbid, 8 years. Like, they really age quickly because of the amount of stress. My point is, what you focus on does expand. So, for instance, when you talk about bringing laughter, when you talk about telling stories and jokes, that is going to expand in your universe. Versus if we were to sit here and just talk about politics, it's going to go negative at some point, because it is that thing that you disagree with. And by what I want the audience to hear is what you focus on expands. And what I've really picked up from you, Danny, throughout, you'll tell a story and you are laughing. This brings joy into your world. Well, guess what? Happier people are more productive people. So I guess I don't really have a question, but it's really a comment of, man, what you focus on expands. I don't know. Any thoughts you have on that, brother? Because my mom is a kindergarten teacher, and same thing, happy as a clam.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I'm being facetious with the law of attraction. I love all those people, and it's exactly right. You're right. Thoughts are things that we become what we focus on. If you think the world's going to hell in a handbasket, guess what? You're right. I mean, I have an uncle who watches cable news 24 hours a day, and I asked him recently, I'm like, has President Biden consulted with you yet? He's like, what? And I'm like, well, you're so informed. I mean, why wouldn't he consult with you? I'm like, well, how is this serving? All you do is gripe. He gripes all day about whatever. And it's like, why do you want to be around that? You want to be, I agree with you. The point you're making is thoughts are things, and I couldn't agree more, is that one of the best things about my wife is she doesn't watch the news. I don't even know if she knows who the president is. She watches comedies. She'll watch every episode of Friends 5 times over, and she likes I Love Lucy, and I think there's something to be said about that. It's the same reason I watch American movies as opposed to French movies, because in an American movie, if Julia Roberts dies halfway through the movie, I know by the end of the movie they'll resuscitate her and there'll be a happy ending. Whereas in France, the main character, they'll shoot him in the middle of the movie. I'm like, oh my gosh, I think that person's dead. It's like so negative.
Not exactly the hero's journey that we've become accustomed to in our world.
That's right.
So you've mentioned some amazing leaders, and I'm passionate about leadership, brother. And I'm curious, if you were to boil down the attributes that you've seen, both some of the mentors you've talked about, you've mentioned several incredible presidents that have done amazing, things in our history. When you look at leadership and you were to say, if I could, this is what every leader really possesses, is there certain attributes that are permission to play? Like you have to have these to be a leader? And what should we really be striving for to be the best leader in as a parent, as a teacher, as a executive, whatever hat we're wearing? What are these leadership attributes that you've seen that have really been successful?
Yeah, I'll give you 2 stories, both based on presidents. One future president, during the Revolutionary War, there was a commander, and he was forcing his troops to dig ditches. And this gentleman comes up on a horse. He's like, what are you doing? He's like, oh, they're digging ditches. They're not doing a very good job. And so the guy got off his horse and he helped everybody dig the ditches. And he looked at the commander. He's like, is that sufficient? The commander's like, great. He's like, oh, and the commander's like, oh, that was great. Thank you. And the guy gets back on his horse and he leaves, and a person runs up to the commander. He's like, "Oh my gosh, what did General Washington say to you?" He's like, "That was George Washington." And so the point there is, good leaders will go and do the work themselves. They won't ask anybody to do something that they're not willing to do themselves. And I love that. The second president that is just my favorite, and everybody has to just read about him, is Abraham Lincoln. Was just amazing. He's after my own heart. They say when he was just an attorney, he when he'd be arguing a case in a town, people would come from 20 miles away to the tavern the night before, because he'd sit by the fire and he would just tell stories. And during the darkest, bleakest moments of the Civil War, his cabinet, it would drive them nuts, because he'd always try to bust the tension by telling a joke. And you actually see it. A great book by Doris Kearns Goodwin is Team of Rivals, which is something everybody should read, because President Lincoln, when he became president, he took all of his political rivals and made them his cabinet. This is a true story. And it's not an exaggeration. It would be like President Biden naming President Trump to be his Secretary of State. This is exactly what Lincoln did. All these guys hated Lincoln's guts. And by the time Lincoln was assassinated, they were all inconsolable. They're like, "We've lost the greatest leader we've ever had." I mean, Lincoln, one of my favorite quotes by any politician, he said, "I know the best way to defeat my enemies. I shall make them my friends." Wow. Where's that thinking nowadays? I love that. But there's a great story in that book, which made it into the movie Lincoln, which they said was based on Team of Rivals. I'm like, maybe 4 pages of the movie's based on the book, which is typical of Hollywood. But it's a tense meeting with Secretary of War Stanton, and Lincoln starts to tell a story, and Stanton's like, "Not another joke." And Lincoln tells it anyway. He says, "Well, one of the founding fathers, Ethan Allen, he went over to England as an ambassador, and the British soldiers decided to have some fun with him. So they put a portrait of George Washington in the latrine. And so they all played cards with Ethan Allen and gave him all kinds of food and wine and waited for him to have to take care of business. And when he went out to the latrine, he came back and they were all snickering. And they looked at Ethan Allen. They said, "Did you see the portrait of General Washington in the latrine?" And Ethan Allen said, "Why, yes." And they were all stunned. They're like, "It did not offend you?" He said, "Why, no. Every American knows that just the sight of George Washington scares the crap out of the British." Why do you not love that story? And he told stories like that again, these aren't political stories. Reagan, one of my favorite moments ever for a politician was in the presidential debates in 1984. In his first debate with Vice President Mondale, he couldn't keep track of a lot of facts. He was just really forgetful. And so the very first question of the second debate, they said, Sandy Van Oker, the journalist, he said, "Mr. President, you were very forgetful in that first debate. Is your age an issue in this campaign?" And Reagan looks at him, he's like, "I am not going to make age an issue for political gain in this campaign. I am not going to point out to the American public my opponent's youth and inexperience." Even Mondale laughed at that line. That won him the election, that line. I'm like, man. So I think the lesson there is have a little bit of levity. People love to play the victim, but you had said something I loved, which was about control. You can't control the weather. What you can control, is your attitude. There's that great quote, and I can never remember it, by Charles Swindoll, where he's just basically saying, your attitude means more than your education, your background, your ethnic status, your physical, your health. I mean, attitude is everything. He's like, and the great thing about attitude is every day you and I have the opportunity to choose what our attitude will be. I mean, they have Viktor Frankl talks about it in Man's Search for Meaning. I mean, he talks about, I can't even think of the atrocities he had to endure in the concentration camp in Nazi Germany. They killed his family, stripped him of his dignity, of his clothes. He lost all this weight. And he said, the one thing they can't take away from me is my attitude. And like, wow, I mean, that's a lesson for all of us to learn. So again, long answer to a short question, but that's what I get. If I could be a leader, I would be like the Viktor Frankls or the Abraham Lincolns or the George Washingtons. Use their example. There's a lot of wisdom from those three gentlemen. And you know what? I feel bad. Here I am. I'm writing a book right now with women and internationally. Why am I not giving women examples and things like that? Trying to think. Oh, a story I was writing the other day. You'll like this, JM. Who was the first woman in outer space?
I don't know.
Okay, so most Americans will say it's Sally Ride, was like in 1982. What we forget is that Valentina Tereshkova, a Russian cosmonaut, went into outer space 20 years earlier. And she actually, when she was in outer space, she spent more time in space than all of the Mercury 7 astronauts from America spent combined. She's still alive. She's actually a member of their the Duma, which is their parliament. But I'm like, whoa, I had never even heard of her. There's so many stories. The book I'm reading right now is about I'll probably mispronounce her name, Aung San Suu Kyi. She was the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Burma in 1991. And oh my gosh, the atrocities that have happened in Burma, it's unbelievable to me. I mean, I'm like, wow, I didn't know any of this stuff. And here's this woman who's the voice of her people. I mean, she's been in house confinement now for like 20 years. It's ridiculous. So there's people out. I mean, my mom, one of the best people I mean, everybody has a mom. My mom was great. She was on a school board. It was her and 6 men. There's a lot of 6-to-1 votes when she was on the board. And I'm like, I love that. And I, one of the stories I wrote was about in this book was about Women's World Cup is happening. I love the U.S. women's soccer team. I love watching them. I prefer watching them to the men because they play as a team. They're joyful as a team. You don't see them faking injuries and griping about bad calls. I love them. And there's a story about this girl, Margaret Merriam. She was born, I think there were 7 children in her family. Her dad was in the Air Force and she was born with a club foot. And so her family, they had her go through operations and all kinds of things when she was a child. And finally she was like 2 years old and they finally had corrected her club foot. And once she was out of her operations, she just ran. She ran like the wind. She was an athlete from the beginning. She loved playing sports, but she looked up to her brother who played football. And so because of that, she joined the football team and she was the first girl to start on the boys football team. And the boys didn't even mind because she was so good. They liked her. But the sport that she really loved was soccer. And at age 15, I don't know if it's to this day, but at that point, she was the youngest member of the women's national soccer team. She wound up going to the University of North Carolina. All 4 years she was there. They won the national championship. She led the team when they were in the Olympics in 1996. She led the team to the gold medal. And then she retired from soccer because shortly after that, her older brother unfortunately caught this disease and he died. And she was just despondent, and she watched her team on TV and she saw that they all were wearing black armbands in honor of her brother. And that pulled her back to the team. She's like, I got to go back to the team. This is my family. And she led the team to the 98 Women's World Cup. When she retired, she had scored more goals than any other woman in soccer history of the world. When she was at North Carolina, because she was so good, she was nicknamed after another famous Tar Heel, Michael Jordan. So everybody called her Jordan. Her family, they had a nickname for her. They just called her Mia because her name was Mia Hamm. And it's like, these are the stories. Like, people need to hear positive stories. There's so many sad stories. That's why I watch CBS Sunday Morning. If you're ever going to watch a show on TV, watch CBS Sunday Morning. Steve Hartman has my dream job. He gets to report all the positive stories out there. But there are amazing, it's the same thing. My wife hates it when we watch the Olympics because I usually root for teams other than America. And she's like, why are you rooting against America? I'm like, honey, who am I going to root for? The American with the microchips in his Nikes, or the barefoot Sudanese refugee who just survived a civil war? Of course I'm rooting for that guy. And then they do the background story, and the guy, he's like, oh, I learned how to run when I was running away from the bullets in my village. I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's amazing. But people need that. This is why I try to get people off social media. I mean, it's a great place for people to gripe and moan and talk about all their wah, wah. Everybody has a sad story. Be a little bit different. Be the positive light in the room. Be the one people, you're not sucking joy, you're giving joy to the room. I'm sorry, I get passionate about this stuff.
Oh, brother, you can talk on preach on this, because look, we need more of it. It is fascinating because you brought up my favorite book, which is Man's Search for Meaning. I read it every year. And again, it's not a happy story. It's a brutal story. And the story I have, I'm literally reading it on a flight from San Diego back to Sacramento. And I'm in the bulkhead, and it's not a big book. It's 160 pages. And this woman looks at me and says, oh, some easy reading. And I turn to her and I am bawling. This is not a book to read on an airplane, people. If I tell you to go read it, do so in your own home, because you're going to have tears of joy. Danny, you're fascinating, man. I could talk to you all day long. I'll give you a quick open forum here. Anything I didn't know enough to ask you before we start to kind of wrap up the show?
Well, one thing you just hit upon, which I hope all your listeners got, was that Man's Search for Meaning is an incredible book, and it's not a very long book. Some of the best books I've ever read are very short. Think and Grow Rich is around 250 pages. The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I mean, it's amazing how a lot of the short books are the best ones. So I would encourage everybody to read those. I actually have one of my websites is called lazyreaders.com. Again, lazyreaders.com. If you subscribe, it's a free subscription. Once a month for the rest of your life, I update it with 10 book recommendations, 3 or 4 adult level, 3 or 4 young adult level, and 3 or 4 children's level books, all under 250 pages. So you have something you can read when you're on a flight from San Diego to Sacramento, or if you're stuck in a boring meeting. And as a thank you for letting me join you today, JM, I wanted to give everybody a couple of gifts. So when you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, again, freegiftfromdanny.com, I'm going to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed, which is a book I wrote for a school principal who was trying to keep his faculty and staff positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation, demonstrates the same concept. You can read that in 5 minutes, start off your meeting with a Dr. Seuss book. And then I'm also going to give you everybody access to a 5-day reading challenge I did last summer for about 700 parents online around the world, where every day for a week, I'll give you all kinds of ideas on how to get your kids to read more, read better, and most importantly, to love reading. The reason being, I think schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it learning how to read if you never want to read? I teach people why to read, because I've never had to tell a kid, go watch TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read. I want them to choose to read on their own because they love it. And the way you do that is by giving people the passion, by sharing stories from Viktor Frankl, from Napoleon Hill, all these, and Og Mandino, people like that. So if you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, that's a thank you. JM, I just love everything that you're doing. I mean, listening to your podcast is like reading a really good book. I come away feeling happier, stronger, and better informed. So thanks for all you're doing.
Brother, thank you. Literally, this could go on. This could be a Joe Rogan podcast, the amount of information I could get from you. And just, you're just a genuine, nice, happy guy. And I love that. Thank you for the gifts. The audience, I'm sure, will love it. Go check Danny out, you guys. I mean, 16 books. He's working on another one. All these free gifts. It's amazing, brother. And thank you for coming on and just bringing your passion. I love it.
Thanks so much. God bless.
You guys, I told you, happy, healthy, wealthy. They literally, you are going to get so much from the gifts that he offered. He gave you so many amazing stories that you can implement today. You can be a most interesting guy at the bar, or the best, way to start a speech. He provided that to you. So please pass this on to someone that is looking to get better. Danny 100% did that with us today. And until next time, remember, I appreciate you all so much. We'll talk soon. Thank you so much for listening. If this content is delivering value to you, please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review us. That helps us build this community, and that is what we are all about. Building this community as big as we can, helping as many people as we can, and deliver as much value as possible. Be sure to head over to letsgowinpodcast.com for information on my coaching courses, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Let's Go Win 365. Let's go win and transcend in life.
This is the Let's Go Win podcast with your host, J.M. Ryerson.